for something like this, for the facial topology, again, I do recommend merging the ears and the neck in together. So if they're not, I pretty much always recommend that, unless there is a stylistic choice or reason behind that. So I'm going to go and just try to locate that. Is that the neck or the nose? There's the ears. Okay, so neck, there's the neck. So I'll just make sure they're kind of above one another and then merge down. And then again, I got to locate the head here. I think that's it, yep. So I'll drag that up. Merge down. Okay, so I'll go to, let's see, I'll solo this for a second. And I'll basically Dynamesh this together. Now, if you hit Dynamesh right away, it could be too low res. So I usually like to try to match or exceed the poly count of the subtool when I'm Dynameshing, just to hopefully prevent any loss. And if there's more detail in one area, I might just try to go, again, above and beyond that if I can. Also notice too, when you Dynamesh, right, if you're Dynameshing things together that already have polygroups and you want to keep them, they disappear. That's in part because of this little paint icon on the subtool. So if you disable that, again, I recommend doing this on a duplicate. So always a good idea to keep or preserve your original model. Duplicate, turn off the paint icon, because we're just kind of working towards getting a singular mesh for the head, right? So up the resolution, Dynamesh. It's about the same. I'm not exactly super keen or in dire need of keeping every polygroup in the ear. Maybe the broader stroke ones. So yeah, I'll worry about that in a bit. Okay, and then usually for the base of the neck, I'll cut the bottom out or off. So for that, I'll use trim just to kind of tidy it up a bit, which will create a polygroup, and then I'll wind up deleting that polygroup. Go to mesh editing, delete hidden. So I'll turn off Dynamesh and then remesh, keep groups. I'll turn off all the options except I'll keep smooth groups. Mainly I turn off adapt, that's a default. Adapt is going to increase the poly count to fit details that might be getting erased. In this case, I don't really care for it. I often don't need it. I find it more of a struggle. So I'm going to just go in half. Usually I work by z-remeshing in half, then in half again, then in half again. So that's kind of my general method. I find to get the best results. One of the reasons why is, like, I'll show you at really low poly what can happen. I'm going to hide off some of this stuff here. So I'm going to simplify these polygroups, by the way, just for the ears, right? So I'll kind of just make one big group in here. Okay. Yeah, if you have that smoothing slider, smooth group slider set up, as you go to lower and lower polys, or if you go right away to, let's say, 5,000, it can really destroy the underlying shape, but it can help eliminate some of the wobbliness, let's say, in here, okay? Now, something else I should do, which I'll mention, is I should create circular loops for the lips or the mouth. So I'm going to do that right here. I'm just going to basically create, through masking, Control P, and then I'll Control Shift click on that twice to hide it. Then again, I'll create another loop. All right, to basically help create those circular loops around the mouth. And then I'll get out of solo. I'll show you a trick. If you hold Shift and click on the little eyeball icon on the subtools, it'll basically hide everything. I'll make sure to return visibility back to the subtool I'm working on, and then the eyeballs. And a really kind of great, quick trick to this is to go to Z plugin. Oh, is it in here? Yeah, I don't know if it's installed in this one, but yeah, I had a tool in here that would, I can't remember if it's built in or not. Oh, intersection masker. So what it does is it looks at subtools that are overlapping one another. Now, what does it say? Live building system. Oh, I see. It's complaining because there's not a watertight mesh, so I can just do that for now temporarily by closing the hole on that mesh. Okay, I'll go back to create intersection mask. So now if I hide the eyeballs, oops, I think I might have been on the wrong subtool. Let's double check that. Try that one more time. Yeah, usually what it would do is actually create a mask on the model, and I could just turn that into a polygroup to get an exact shape. In this case, you know, it's not a big deal. I'll just try to emulate that as close as I can. And it doesn't have to be perfect either. I can kind of just go in and have a slightly larger group here. Okay, so Control W for that, okay? Then I'll isolate this and probably have one more loop in here. I would say even if you're not, like let's say you're going to use additional mesh or no mesh at all and do a cartoony blink with like the iris and pupil, that's fine. I'll just do it for the purpose of demonstration, okay? So I'll zero mesh in half. I'm at 56,000. Okay, so you see the loops too are getting a lot cleaner, okay? Another trick I will show you. Let's go to Skin Shade 4 here. I'll turn off Colorize if it's still on. There. Sometimes it's good to evaluate your mesh. Like you might have little errors like this, little tiny polygroups. There is a little sort of tool or trick for this too under polygroups. There's something called merge stray groups, and that will basically force that to be in its own group. Another trick I use a lot, you can use a separate brush. There's actually if you go under Lightbox, which is your comma key, and then you go to, where am I going? Lightbox, brush. There's a smooth category, and there's actually additional variations of smooth. So if you go in here, there's actually one that will literally just smooth polygroups, so smooth groups. Now when you double click it, it'll probably warn you, hey, this will replace your shift key as the default brush. So if I hold shift now, it's not going to alter the surface too much, but it will clean up and average out the kind of roughness or wobbliness of those groups, okay? So that can be very, very useful to creating maybe a cleaner, kind of tighter looking topology, okay? Now, what I prefer to do is actually just use regular smooth, and again, this is a trick I use all the time now. You can hold shift, start to click, and then let go, and it will maintain the surface shape, but improve the distribution of the polys. It's a little bit different than the smooth groups, but I find it sort of in between what smoothing does and smooth groups. Okay, so I'll remesh again in half. I'm probably going to start to turn on the smooth groups a bit just because it can distort or affect parts of the mesh. And again, I'm going to delete that polygroup. Delete hidden. Because you can lose kind of crisp edges and things of that nature that way. Okay, so when it comes to topology 2, I've got we call it a budget in a lot of different sectors of 3D. A lot of times you are allocated X number of polys for a particular prop, a character, an environment, elements of the environment. So your approximate polygon budget is 40,000 polys, okay? Doesn't mean you have to use it all. Usually in production they'll say, I want a character to be 40,000 or 100,000. You want to be within like 5 or 10,000 polys of that budget. You don't want to be way low and definitely not over. In this case, you can be far below if it fits the style of your character. You can have 5,000 polys, 10,000 polys. I don't mind for a head or a body. But what I usually suggest is you know your poly count. And when I do topology, in this case, the Z-remeshing is quick. It's a few dozen clicks and it's done, right? So if I know I'm going to 40,000, when you divide a mesh or smooth it, it's multiplying the poly count by 4. So if I want to get to low poly or a base that's clean, I divide by 4. So that gets me to 10. If I were to work really fast, I would divide by 4 and maybe divide by 4 one more time. So I kind of work in those multiples of like 625 polys or 2500 polys, because the less vertices and edges and polygons you have to deal with, the faster you can work. In this case, that's really working like 64 times faster. If you were to build a base mesh of 625 and then just divide it up and project it to get the shapes back. In this case, the remesh is working fine. And this, I think, is still quite good for the, I think for this character. I think it works quite well, actually. And again, for the mouth cavity, I'll show you a little trick that I use. By the way, as I mentioned before, we don't have the texture. We don't have any sculpting that's there. It's kind of gone now. So the trick to that is, again, to unhide, make visible the new mesh and the retopology. And you basically want to go to project all. So usually what I'll do is I'll project all. If I solo this, this is the new head, right? New topology, divide, project, and again, I want to get to at least the resolution of this mesh. Divide, project. Okay, so that now gets me exactly, pretty much back to where this thing was, right? And what's great about this too is like this base of 10, maybe that's the base I keep, or you could go up one step, like this is 40,000 at the next step, so that could be your real base if you wanted to have that be your base, okay? And I'll go back to turning off colorize just so we can kind of see this a little bit better. If you're to do cartoon eyelids, eyeballs, I'll show you my trick for this. So I duplicate this. I will inflate. So usually I do it inflate. It depends on the amount, but deformation, inflate. Yeah, maybe like 2 or 3 is fine in this case. Then I'll go back up and duplicate the inflated spheres, because what I can do next is simply go into something like, usually I'll use trim, and I'll trim the eyeball on the right side of the face, which is screen left, right? So I'll explain why in a minute. Okay, so you see that kind of slices that off. And next up what I'll do is mirror and weld, because that, when I do mirror and weld, the reason I chopped off this eyeball or eyelid is that if I do mirror and weld, I know it'll flip over. It's not quite symmetrical, it looks like, so I'll just tweak that a little bit if I can. So maybe there's a bit of a pivot issue there, but I'll take a large move brush. And by holding Alt, you can kind of just push and pull and tweak those shapes around. So that can give you kind of a nice, right, solid eyelid shape, let's say, for a cartoony character. Okay. And yeah, there's the duplicates. So it's kind of the same approach. We would sort of take this and sort of come across and slice for our lower, and then again a quick mirror and weld. Okay, so I think I've overdone it with the thickness a bit, but you get the point, right? So that could be the basis of a low poly, sorry, not low poly, but sort of stylized eyelids, right? So back, before I finish, the mouth cavity on this, I'll just solo again. Oops. Don't want expose. Okay. Yeah, so for the mouth cavity, if you've got, and I'll do this too, so sometimes like the loops kind of even in this area aren't good, but what I usually will do is kind of control click on the lip region. I'll reset this, and then if you hold control and move back, oh, this thing has divisions, so I do have to kind of delete those. If you do have divisions, just go to your lowest division level and delete higher. Control, click and drag back. Now I usually will inflate or scale this up a little bit just to create the mouth cavity. And if we flip the mask around, you might want to re-polygroup that by hitting Control W. Next up, what we can do is go to Z Modeler, and if you hover over an edge, Z Modeler, hover over an edge, you can click on Insert Loop and it does one loop, okay? But if you click or hover over the edge, hit spacebar, go to multiple loops. I'll just show you what it does by default, and then I'll show you some kind of really great tricks to fixing this. If you middle mouse click and drag up or down, you get more or less loops, but you see it alternates, which can be useful, right, for certain kind of tech stuff, mechanical stuff, sci-fi stuff. But in this case, I'm going to, again, go to spacebar. I want the same polygroup. So it's going to create a new polygroup, but make it the same group. So that's basically the mouth cavity group, okay? So if you're going to have teeth in there or whatever, you can have that. Now, as an additional option, I usually like to kind of inflate that. So you can actually, again, holding spacebar, go down to interactive elevation. So now as I drag up, that's the poly count. But if I go left to right, you see I can kind of create like a mouth bag, essentially. I've seen people do this where they take like a sphere and squash it into the shape they want and then overlap it and almost do like either a Dynamesh where it cuts it out, it creates the cavity, or they use Boolean, the Booleans. I prefer this method because I feel like it's a little bit more precise. I'm going to add one more loop here. So I'm just going to go back to single loop, and I'll show you why, because I want to restore those lips. So what I want to do is create probably just one polygroup in here. So I'm going to go to, you can say polygroup, a poly loop. I really hope more software, by the way, and I find this really hard to do, by the way, this poly loop, a polygroup, but I'll probably find a different way to do it if I can. Yeah, what it's supposed to do is kind of create a new poly group, you see, as you kind of stroke in the direction of. I'm probably not doing it right, but you see as I go in a particular direction from a polygon face, it'll create a poly loop poly group. So I'm trying to do that in here. In this case, it's kind of being a little goofy, so my alternative is just to hide this off. Using select lasso, for some reason it's not the same function as select rectangle, but if you go to select lasso and control shift click on an edge, it'll quickly hide a whole loop of edges, a whole ring of edges. And then I can take this, let's go to double-sided so we can see it a little better. Yes, double, there. So I'll just hit Control W, so that's now a new group, okay? So next what I'll do is I'll take those, instead of polygroup, I'll say extrude, polygroup all. And there you bring back those lips, okay? So that allows you to get that mouth cavity super quick. I used to do a long method that would take me like 45 minutes in Maya. And now I can do it in like under 5 minutes in ZBrush, okay? Again, polygroups are not a thing really outside of ZBrush from what I've seen. So sometimes when you're bringing something to another software, what I will do is actually just go into Z plugin, UV master, polygroups unwrap. It's not going to be my actual unwrap for the character because it's all these different shells, right? But what it's useful for is saying, okay, I want to select, this is now its own UV shell. So in Maya, you can say select by UV shell and quickly grab it, okay? So next step, I'll control click on that group and maybe just like reposition it. You know, maybe I want it to be more further forward or, oops, auto save. Alt click on that, and then yeah, we can kind of just like bring that forward. We can also close the lips by scaling down or just simply by moving. Another trick I use to kind of create closed lips, very simple. Take the move brush, fairly large move brush, up and down. And they'll eventually close. Okay, so that's one technique. Another technique you can use for closing the mouth, because a lot of times it is sort of required to close the lips. So I'm just going to use my shift and then remove technique. Yeah, I'll sometimes inflate closed. That I find works well too. And another technique for that is to also, sorry, I'll just go back here moving, is move topological. So where that red dot is, it'll recognize, hey, you're trying to only move that side of the mesh, not the other side at the same time, even with the large brush. So it will, for the most part, try to ignore the stuff on the other side. So that can also be very, very helpful, okay? And you see it even with stuff entering the red circle, whereas if I just had the regular move brush, right, anything in that red circle will get moved. So the topological brush is literally meant to say, okay, I'm recognizing the topology of what's happening. I'm only going to move the stuff that you're really intending to grab. Gets a little tougher in the corners, but again, the sort of back and forth technique does work fairly good. Okay,